And we are live. Do you guys want to send your shout outs now? All right, welcome. So welcome everyone to our Public Finance and Security webinar. It's hosted by the Africa Legal Network Academy. We are glad that you can join us for this timely and challenging topic. I'm Daniel Ngumy, the Rule of Law Advisor for the Academy, and I'll be introducing the speakers as well as ALN Academy for you today. ALN Academy is a rule of law charity whose main focus areas are in ESG, and the green economy, intra-African trade, youth and migration, gender, as well as peace and democracy. All of these we see as cross-cutting topics, and we deal with them in a number of ways, one of which is you being here today for this webinar. The Academy promotes the rule of law in Africa and aims to enhance good governance, quality legal education and capacity building, influencing and leading ideas, to make you think broadly about all of the stuff that's happening on your continent. And finally, we would like your participation today through your questions, your concerns, coming off after you reflect, of course, come to us with ideas that you may have on any contributions that you have. In the meantime, we value your feedback. So do the thing and scan the thing. And as the webinar goes by, please don't forget to give us your like, share, subscribe, and all of that fun stuff. All right, so, our webinar today is themed the impact of security challenges on public financing and economic development in Africa. In the last 5 years, Africa has been confronting significant and complex challenges which have undermined national security and various forms of security in different ways. These challenges span violent extremism, food insecurity, civil conflicts, organized crime, maritime insecurity, cybersecurity threats. There is a lot happening on this continent. The costs of these challenges have been profound and have had a negative effect on our continent's ability to rebound, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the challenges that I'm going to mention, but you'll hear a lot more from our speakers, include increased public debt levels which have rose to 66% in 2023, and debt servicing. African governments allocated 4.8% of their GDP in total, in debt servicing compared to 2.6% in health, for instance. So, and the high debt servicing costs have limited their ability to invest in essential services. In terms of the budget allocation, we have fiscal deficits that have widened in the region to 5.2% of the GDP across the continent, up from 4.8%. So the real balance now is, defense versus development, in defense of all various forms of security. And that's what today we're trying to interrogate and see what the way forward is going to be. So, joining us today to unpack some of these challenges that we are facing in our public budgets and the capacity of our governments to allocate more resources to social spending, as well as the ways forward, are distinguished speakers. The first person I'll call up is Declan Gavin, who is the Managing Director of Exigent Risk. Declan is the Managing Director of Exigent Risk Advisory, a leading Nairobi-based strategic advisory firm. Declan is a country risk expert offering advisory services to leading private and multinational companies in strategic, geopolitical, trade, credit and security risks across emerging markets in Africa. He has extensive experience working with investors, private funds, international development organizations, diplomatic missions, and NGO. Whew, Declan. We're so happy to have you today. And then our next panelist is the Managing Director. See, we've got big deal people here, guys. Managing Director of Expertise Global. Wangari is a distinguished Africa fiscal policy economist and a leading authority in public finance management, with over 20 years of experience shaping fiscal policies across the continent. As the founder and Managing Director of Expertise Global, Wangari works closely with governments, international institutions, and development organizations to address complex fiscal policy challenges. Her work emphasizing building robust frameworks to strengthen subnational revenue streams, optimize budget strategies, enhance intergovernmental coordination, and support governance across sectors such as education, health, and climate resilience. So as you can see, we're in very, very good hands. Welcome, Wangari. And finally, but not least, is Julians Amboko, who is public finance focused communication professional. He is an International Monetary Fund journalism fellow and has published with the London School of Economics Business Review, the International Growth Center, World Economic Forum, and the Journal for Sustainable Development. And he currently consults for the Nation Media Group and the Old Bank, and he's a bit of a celebrity. So welcome, Julians. And finally, we have our lovely moderator, who is the managing partner of Anjawala and Kana, the building that you're all currently sitting in. And Daniel is going to be moderating our session today. He is a public finance, policy, trade expert with lots of years of experience. And today, he's going to be taking charge of this session, and I'm very excited. Welcome, Daniel. Okay. So Daniel, you may go ahead and get us started when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Allow me to use the microphone, because even though I'm sure we can all hear each other, we have people online. And I think it's a very exciting session. I'm very, very excited to be here with you this morning. Thank you for coming, and thank you for making it. For those who are joining us online in the audience, we have about 30 people from various parts of Nairobi. And I hope that we can make this as engaging as possible. You will have seen on the screen, I think it's gone off now, but there's a Slido. Maybe you can put back the page which has a Slido number, just for purposes of commenting as we carry on. So anyone who wishes to, there it is, the number is, you can use that QR code, or alternatively, you can go to Slido and then enter the event code, which is 2399863, and put in your comments as we carry on. So ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it's my extreme pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. We're talking about the impact of security challenges on public financing and economic development in Africa. The theme is quite pertinent, complex, touching on the foundational interplay between security, public finance, sustainable economic growth, and more broadly, sustainability. Today, Africa is at a crossroads. On one hand, we see unparalleled opportunities for economic growth and advancement on the African continent, driven by the youthful population, driven by technology, innovation, vast natural resources. On the flip side, we have persistent and emerging security challenges, ranging from violent extremism to civil conflicts to cyber threats, all of which pose significant hurdles for our shared aspirations for progress. So this morning, or it's now this afternoon, the security challenges that we are going to be talking about don't exist in isolation. They have profound implications on public finance, on economic stability. They talk about we're dealing with security in the broadest sense, from basic human security to internal security in countries, cross-border issues pertaining to security. And all these then play together when we're looking at the scarce resources that we have. These scarce resources are required for basic things like, provision of health, provision of educational advancement. A lot of the issues that we saw in Kenya on June 25th were about the public finance bill, and how that then interplays in the broader issues that countries need to think about. Kenya in particular sits at a very sort of epicenter of action, because to our north we have Sudan, which is currently in conflict. We have Somalia also in conflict. And we have all sorts of political instability in the region, including in our country itself. So really this morning, what I'd love to hear from the people we have here with us is just really talking through these sort of issues. And the key themes of reflection this morning, we will break it down into 3 key buckets. The first bucket is about balancing priorities. How can African governments strike the right balance between security, spending, and social economic investments? The second broad category will be talking about governance and accountability. How can we ensure transparency and accountability in security expenditure to avoid mismanagement and corruption? And the third category will be talking about innovative solutions, what role technology, regional collaboration, and PPPs can play in all this. So allow me to start, and I will start with you, Declan. You're an expert in dealing with security challenges, from cyber security to cyber attacks. For the first time, I heard about Sudan Anonymous. I'd never heard of such an organization ever before in my life. And we suddenly realized that they had the power to shut down our government and government operations. So threats to security are coming in all forms and shapes. Maybe you can set the lay of the land for us. Talk to us what you see as the critical threats and the sort of issues that you see in this part of the world. Over to you, Declan.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Good morning. Okay, so if we look at if we unpack the notion of security, and I'll try to be brief on the remarks, but since it's a very broad question, we need to unpack what security means, because it does include everything from cybersecurity attacks, attacks that don't actually result in any casualties on critical infrastructure. It also involves understanding poverty. It involves equitable access to health care. And it involves policing and terrorism and all of these different things, right? That's what security is. And of course, the purpose of the conversation today is to kind of understand the linkages between public financing and budgeting, for lack of a better term, with security kind of broadly. So if we look at Africa as a continent, which is often analytically unhelpful because it's 54 independent countries, 2,100 distinct language groups. It's not one big entity, but there are themes across the majority of countries in Africa, which can be helpful. If we look at the areas that I'm most focused on, right? These are what I would say kind of the key emerging markets in Africa. Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, Senegal, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, the rest of EAC. These countries, particularly if we take the three most significant or largest of those countries, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, these are the countries which a lot of people place a lot of faith in terms of its macroeconomic outlook, the productive capabilities of human resource, of natural resource, and certainly if we look at kind of diaspora communities from Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, they're prolific across the globe. So there's a lot of, I think, faith within these. But unfortunately, the range of security threats to these countries are actually disproportionate compared to, and sorry if I start relegating other countries, but countries with smaller economies like Zambia or Malawi, Togo. If we compare those three really exciting countries, they genuinely have a wider range of security threats, and it's not only because their economies are a little bit more developed. So this is a significant issue. If we look at Kenya, kind of more specifically, Daniel mentioned kind of cybersecurity. This is a massive problem, and I think we now know it's a massive challenge to financial institutions, to our banking sector, to the protection of our individual identities. If you remember a lot of the anxiety around Huduma Namba, these sorts of things, and the vulnerability of Kenyan systems, or perceived vulnerability of Kenya's systems to compromise, is both from kind of internal actors and then external actors, Anonymous Sudan. Last kind of point, because I don't want to ramble on too much. If we look at Anonymous Sudan, it's true that the U.S. State Department of Justice kind of sanctioned and called for kind of the arrest of some Sudanese nationals who were tied to that attack. My reading of it, based off what I heard, this was actually backed by Russian Killnet, which is one of the kind of state-affiliated cyber criminal units. This is kind of what came out in the aftermath, which means that when Anonymous Sudan kind of attacked the e-citizen platform, it was actually on behalf of other non-state actors. which means that Kenya, as it continues to integrate within the global system, is going to find itself exposed, whether it likes it or not, to kind of global security trends, not just those from Somalia or Dandora or wherever. So thank you very much.
So Declan, thank you for that. I think turning to you, Julians. So Declan has sort of set the scene. So he's told us threats are many, including cybersecurity. He's talked about differences and countries that are more vulnerable than others. For example, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, much more vulnerable in comparison to, say, Togo or Malawi. Now, when we think about, and you're a regular speaker on public finance, and I'm sure many of you in the room have watched Business Redefined on NTV many times when Julians is moderating. Just talk to us about what you see in terms of GDP growth in East Africa. Talk to us about what you think about foreign investment. Talk to us about what you think about AfCFTA and more broadly where trade seems to be heading on the African continent. And maybe give us views. How do we balance all this? There are countries like, for example, in Mozambique, where civil war and insurgency has recently caused significant repercussions on economic stability. We can talk about the same thing with Southern Sudan and Sudan more broadly, where today if you go to Khartoum, Khartoum is a ghost town, and people had put in billions in that country. So how do you see that interplay between economic development vis-a-vis crisis and war in a more broader sense?
Thanks, Dan. When the introductions were being done, I said we have 2 MDs and then we have a news editor. So, and the thing about news editors and news by and large is that we are storytellers. So I want to bring this closer home. The spectrum of security, as Declan said, is quite wide. But we all remember, well, I presume we all remember the events of June 25th, 2024, when Parliament was breached on account of protests around Finance Bill 24. And I remember when it hit me that we have a canary in the coal mine here, because whenever the finance bill comes out, I do my threads on X or Twitter, for those of you who were there earlier. And this time I got an invitation from a group. It's called Bunge la Mayut. And I even showed my wife and she asked me, are you safe going for this presentation? So I went nonetheless and did my presentation, and the level of interrogation and rigor that I was taken through on finance bill, clause by clause, was so unprecedented. So I left the presentation and I went and called one of my friends in Parliament. He's the chairman of one of these committees, and I told him, my friend, there's a train coming your way and you had better be ready, because the repercussions would be massive. I've never been taken through this kind of thing by such a group. Fast forward, we have protests and etc. And now the ripple effect is, I met a group of C-suite executives. There are those who will tell you, we have to shut down business twice a week because of the protests. It has implications. There those who will tell you now this is the best season in the pharmaceutical space, especially because hospitals front-loaded their demand to be able to circumvent those kind of challenges. So it's quite a checkered landscape when you look at it in a very broad sense. But now, coming to your question, Dan, is that in Mozambique, I remember I think it was March or April of 2021, when the French multinational Total suspended a $20 billion investment in the LNG space on account of security concerns, because Al-Shabaab, etc., had caused havoc on that side. Now, Mozambique today is a $50 billion GDP country. Think about it that way. Their per capita income is just about, what, 1,500 USD. And you are suspending such a significant investment because of security concerns. It has revenue implications on the government side. It has welfare implications on the citizen side. Because if you look at them, their tax revenue, on average in a given year, is about, what, $4.55 billion, right? So you begin to appreciate what security concerns mean from a public finance perspective when you look at it that way. Here's a country that could have harnessed that sort of investment coming in, changing lives. Of course, there are negative externalities, as you would always know, but that's what it means. On a day-to-day basis, there are guys who would have gotten jobs they don't have. There's revenue which would have come into the country. It eventually did not come. That would have had an impact on your FX positioning. It eventually did not. and many other things. And of course, you know, Mozambique is one of the countries which defaulted on one of its debts. So there's that perspective which we have to put into focus. Coming closer to the Horn of Africa, this year, I think around May, I remember we did a story on the East African. So the Nation Media Group has this broader, this multiple platforms. One of them is the East African, which basically covers this entire region. And we did this story around South Sudan grappling with a foreign exchange crunch because their FX reserves dipped to a historic low. Why? Because of conflict in Sudan, oil exports cannot move as they typically do. Now, this is a country which heavily relies on that. And security is such a big factor. It's such a big dynamic whenever you think about public finance. And you never take it seriously until you're in a situation where, because of security concerns, your public finance framework and architecture is not the way it optimally is or it normally is in normal circumstances. You come back home. So when we were analyzing the numbers for the first quarter of the current financial year, FY 24-25, we all know that we start in July. So July, August, September. And we've missed the revenue target by a huge quantum. And when you sit down with the authorities, and this is where I'd like to finish this entry point, is that they're telling you, look, guys, we had these proposals. Of course, we saw what happened with finance bill. We could not meet the revenue targets. But we still passed the appropriations bill, right? So we still passed the spending side of the budget without a commensurate alignment on the revenue side because of those kind of concerns, which just pervaded the discussion at the time. So maybe let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Julians. Very interesting. I think we're now grappling on how we approved the spending without approving the commensurate gains on the revenue side. And I'm sure many of you in the room will soon be hearing about the Tax Laws Amendment Bill and be seeing, in direct outputs, some of these changes. I want to turn to you, Wangari. Now, we've heard from Declan, we've heard from Julians. I want us to talk about fiscal policy. And in Kenya in particular, we have this decentralized government. Now, the decentralized government was meant to deliver services closer to the people. The whole idea of the decentralized service government was to ensure that education, health, things like services, housing, was being provided at mashinani, close to people, right, on the ground. How do you see that having reflected over the last few years? Is this experiment working? Is it not working? We're now 10 years into the new constitution, and we will soon be talking about other threats like corruption. What's your sense of the lay of the land, and do you see any connection between decentralization, fiscal decentralization, and more broadly, security? Over to you, Wangari.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think it's, I'm glad that Declan and Julians went ahead of me, because I think they kind of lay the ground or the foundation for what I'm going to say. So in terms of fiscal policy, when you think about fiscal policy is about a balance, right? The security sector is just a sector like any other, right? So there's security, there's health, there's education, there's agriculture. All these sectors work together to provide us an environment that we as Kenyans can thrive and grow our businesses and reach our highest potential. After all, that is what the role of government is. We all pay our taxes, we all say what our priorities are, and part of those priorities is ensuring that we have a safe and secure place within which we are able to conduct our business. But what are we seeing in practice? We're seeing there's a lot of challenges across Africa, not just in Kenya. Now there's climate-related conflicts. There's femicide that's happening in the newspapers every day. We're seeing a lot of news about gender-based violence and extrajudicial killings. Al-Shabaab is on the corner, border conflicts. So in those scenarios, the economy cannot thrive if the people are not able to feel safe and secure. Businesses cannot form, and the like. So security is a very crucial aspect. Now, when we come to decentralization and the decentralization that was brought in by the new constitution, it's very clear that security is a national government function, right? So the national government is responsible for making sure that the country is safe. But in practice, it is really something that even the county governments have to participate in. Because at the end of the day, security is not something that befalls us. Security is something that we are all involved in, right? So at a county, at a subnational level, it is in the interest of the counties to ensure that they're well coordinated with the national government to ensure that security is provided to its citizens. What does this look like? It looks like policies that are made at the national level are locally sensitive. It also looks like policies or resources provided to people on the ground to be able to deliver. You know, we had I don't know if you guys remember the Nyumba Kumi initiative, which is a national government initiative. That cannot work if you don't have strong coordination structures on the ground. So fiscal decentralization, decentralization in and of itself should allow for that. But in practice and what we see on the ground is that coordination between the national and county governments is very low. There's a lot of distrust between the two levels of government. But not only that, even intra-department. If you look at the way national and county governments at the local level are working, sometimes they're not communicating with each other. I'll give an example that's not exactly security related, but for example, we were in a jurisdiction where they built a school, primary school, and a primary school is a national government function. But in a primary school, you need water, you need, roads, local roads to access the school, and you need a lot of other functions that are county-related. So you find in some situations where the national government builds a school, but they don't have sanitation facilities because they've not coordinated well with the county governments. So coordination, I think, is a key factor when it comes to this. So a dollar spent, like Julians was saying, the national security budget has actually started ballooning. And I was looking at it. I was looking at the Budget Review and Outlook paper, which is one of the public finance documents that was recently released. And national security is actually one of the top 4, I think, spending areas. I think it's education first, then we have energy, ICT, and infrastructure, then we have, I think, public administration, and then national security is a big one. Now, for us, in a context where we don't have, we don't have we're not like Israel, for example, right? We're not like Palestine, where there's imminent threat or there's danger on us all the time. Yes, we do have terrorist threats, and we're targeted a lot because we're a very global and externally facing economy. But we're not in that situation where there's existential threat or there's threat that is is evident every day. So the question for us is, every dollar spent in security is a dollar not spent, for example, in social sectors. Is it worth it? As economists would say, as my friend Julius would say, what's the opportunity cost? Yeah? What is the opportunity cost of spending a dollar in education, in security, and not spending in education? And these things are interdependent, right? I know this will come later, and I just wanted to mention it briefly, that there are other ways of thinking about security. Security is a reactive action. But if we think proactively about making sure that there are jobs provided so that people are not radicalized, we're making sure that healthcare is provided, that SHIP is working, that people are not feeling desperate, their kids are not dying, making sure that education at the national level, people are getting the education that they have so that they can get the jobs that they need, so that if they again not radicalized or not unable to get gainful employment, and therefore practicing in internal, even external threats, right? There are things that government can do to ensure that social spending and other infrastructure spending, other spending, energy spending, can be used to counter or to ameliorate the spending that will go into security or defense.
Dan, can I just chime in?
Sure.
Decentralization. So I have a question for us to ponder over. I've always wondered whether the framers of the 2010 Constitution envisioned this fiscal decentralization optimally. If you read the PFM Act, what are the sources of on-source revenue? Now, on-source revenue is a revenue which counties or the devolved units generate for themselves. And they normally have targets every year, if you look at the reports from the Control of Budget. The sources of on-source revenue are parking, entertainment, advertisement like billboards, etc. Now, those sources of on-source revenue make sense in Nairobi, in Kisumu, in Mombasa. Think about a far-flung county in some corner of Kenya. What parking are they relying on? Yeah. What entertainment are they relying on? And can we really say that they are well positioned to mobilize on-source revenue? Because remember, finally, if you're to actualize your devolved functions in terms of execution and then build on, because remember what Wangari has just said, is that security starts with ensuring we have enough jobs for people to be occupied and gainfully employed, they can generate their own income. But if we have that framing of on-source revenue, and then exchequer releases on equitable share always delaying, I mean, how does that work? Done.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up on a few threads from both Wangari and from Julians. So one of the things that Wangari has said is that if you give people gainful employment, if you create opportunities for people, in turn, it changes the lay of the land as far as security is concerned. So on the border of Kericho County and Kisii, very close to the Tanzanian border, is a small town known as Mulot, Mulot Central, and Mulot Sunset. How many people have ever heard of Mulot? Yeah, only news person, cyber security expert. Who else? I can see from the room maybe two or three other people. Now, Mulot is a center of cyber attacks in Kenya. It's like a very remote village. But I can tell you, I hear a majority of the threats that Kenya has, from hacking of banks to M-Pesa SMSs, you name it, emerge from Mulot Central and Mulot Sunset. It's a shocking statistic, but it shows you that if the people around there are given some other form of gainful employment, maybe we need to have a call center or some form of technology data center there that will change things significantly. I want to turn to balancing security and development priorities. Julians, we've been hearing a lot about SHIF. We've been hearing a lot about the transition between NHIF and social health insurance to the new new authority that has been set up. We've been hearing a lot about the education model, the university financing model that's been talked about. We've been hearing a lot about CBC, and we've been hearing a lot about other needs, like our roads are in dire need of repair and the likes. So how does a government really balance these sort of issues? Or how do they strike the balance between the need to provide, use our taxes, and also, of course, the debt financing? A large part of our budget today goes to pay off debt. So how does a government balance all this, at the same time thinking about peace and security for its people and for its nation? Over to you, Julians.
So let me use the case of the Kenyan government. First, we start from the fact that our resource envelope is really constrained. Who knows what the target for ordinary revenue is for FY 24-25? Any takers? About 2.8 trillion shillings, right? Out of the 2.8 trillion shillings, you have 1.1 trillion going to debt service. So you 2.8 knock out that, right? Next is what? She said corruption. Next is the public sector wage bill, right? You have another 800 billion or so knocked out of that. If you do the math, so you came from 2.8 minus 1.1, now minus 800B, right? If you look at the amount you're left with, and if you read the Public Finance Management Act, the first and mandatory checkoffs from the consolidated fund are what? 1 is debt service, yep. 2 is pensions. You can default on anything else, but don't fail to service those 2. So if you take another 300B going to pension obligations, knock it off there. So there's really nothing left. This thing of development spending will not even exist if we strict him. So how does a government balance those societal demands within the realities of a constrained fiscal space? My view is this, and Kenya needs to have a very candid conversation. If we go back to our Public Finance Management Act, it prescribes that the expenditure on wage bill as a proportion of raised revenue should never exceed what? 35%. We are at 46%. Why are we there? Do we have a problem with the bloated wage bill? Yes. Do we need to rationalize it? Yes. And why I'm saying that is because when something like national security is baked into your budget, first of all, a number of items there will be deemed to be what you call the confidential vote.
Yeah.
Confidential vote means you and I don't even have visibility of how much is. And of course, GOK, or the government of Kenya, will tell you it's because of security concerns that we do not disclose, because our adversaries will just look at our budget books and figure out, oh, this is where these guys are spending. This is how we can deal with them. So you don't have much wiggle room around confidential votes, and that's where security falls in by and large. They will give you the broad figures, but specifics you won't get. So what can we deal with? We can deal with issues around, for example, the wage bill. And that is how, if we move from this 46 to 35%, you free up that 11%, we can begin to ask ourselves questions around, are we addressing our educational concerns appropriately? Are we addressing our health concerns as we should? Housing is another, right? And remember, the education sector, if you gobble up the state departments, the three of them, plus Teacher Service Commission, who knows how much is allocated to that sector? Is the largest allocation, 600 billion shillings. 600 billion shillings, of which 300B goes to the Teacher Service Commission. Are we getting value for money, even within that allocation on the education sector? Those are conversations we need to have. Because we don't have much space within which we can say we'll play around with these numbers. We don't, right? Final point, we are finishing our program with the International Monetary Fund in March of 2025. And we need to ask ourselves what the road ahead beyond IMF looks like. Of course, we've had conversations that we are potentially looking for a new program. But in the event that we don't, one, we'll be in a constrained fiscal space. Can we comfortably go to market without an IMF program and raise financing the way we typically do right now to address these needs we are talking about? So even before we go to how can we meet security concerns and social welfare needs within where we are, I think we have more fundamental questions that we need to ask ourselves in terms of how we are organizing our public finance management architecture in-house. Let me leave it there.
So then, Declan, I will ask you a controversial question. Based on what Julians is saying, we should really be focusing on our basic needs for now. Don't make enemies, don't fight anyone, don't go throwing stones where you shouldn't throw stones, right? But recently we have heard that we have recently become a NATO ally. Does that put, how do you call it, a bullseye on our backs as a country? And should we be much more focused on simply dealing with our day-to-day needs and less focused on the work we do? Like, for example, sending police officers to Haiti, being the policeman in the region. Our soldiers have gone to Somalia. We've been involved in DRC Congo. Or do you see this as an essential element that we must balance? That despite the fact that we are constrained, we must look for funding to also support these sort of initiatives. Over to you.
Sure, that's a good question. It's a good question. So I think we need to bottom line something, which is that Kenya does not have a debt problem. Kenya does not have a debt repayment problem. Kenya has a corruption problem. There's enough, by and large, that if corruption was not a factor, there wouldn't be as much of a need to borrow. So borrowing would be less, and repayment would be easier. So if we were to fix that, and if anybody's got any grand ideas on how to do that, we're all ears. That's the bottom line. But it's also unhelpful, right? We have current problems now. We can try to tackle corruption, but it's one of many things that we need to address. With regard to Kenya being a non-NATO ally, and whether that is creating either unnecessary costs, if it's redirecting or misdirecting Kenya's attention from other things, I think in terms of whether Kenya and the Kenyan government has the capacity to manage both kind of robust external relations, both from a strategic security and a geopolitical perspective, and balance those with domestic considerations. For me, there's zero question that Kenya has the intelligence, that people are smart enough and capable enough to be an active and engaged global player while also maintaining all of its domestic priorities. I wouldn't say that for all countries, but for Kenya, there's no doubt in my mind that that the country could. Does the engagement between specifically the United States and Kenya, and we can wrap in, deployments to DRC, a police, which is certainly security, but a lot of people think that that's a military deployment to Haiti. It's not. That's different. That is ultimately the question that I think has not been answered for the Kenyan public. So Kenyans don't see the value in that necessarily, but at least the anecdotal feedback that I receive. But what I could argue, and what I think is true, but again has never been explained, when that relationship between the United States and Kenya and the non-NATO ally provides significant investment in the security sector, right? So that's money that is coming from the U.S. to build up capacity. A great deal of that is in kind of the grant form and in training form, which would theoretically free up money within the defense space and the security space, right? The U.S., for example, provides quite a bit of support to the police as well. If we look at Kenya's security architecture, the majority of Kenya's security officials are actually civilians, right? The National Intelligence Service is a civilian force, right? The police, that's a civilian force, right? DMI, the Department, the Director of Military Intelligence, of course, KDF. These are officers, right? But the majority of the support is actually going to civilian security agencies. And so that is money that Kenya is not spending. Now, the argument that I think you're kind of referring to is, but is this elevation of the status going to create costs and the need to spend where it wasn't there before, right? And I think that that's fair, and that's true, right? I think,
and also to some extent, how do you call it? There's also a cost, the converse, the opportunity costs.
Sure.
That if these soldiers and police officers were focusing on Kenyan issues, maybe we would have, more peace and prosperity in Kenya.
But why? I mean, so I meant to make this point earlier, but it ties in with the development theme we're talking about. What is the Kenyan military doing involved in security issues in Kenya? Right? Because we live here, we think that that's normal. This is not normal. Militaries are not supposed to be doing activities within their borders. Militaries are offensive, externally leaning things. Now, there are certain, right, I mean, if you look at NYS, in the US we have the National Reserve. These are different, right? And we know they're different. Yes, they're part of the military. But what is KDF doing? KDF should be at the border, and they are, right? But all of these posts, this is a problem across kind of Africa in general, is militaries are not for external enemies. They're there in place first and foremost for employment opportunity, right? And secondly, to quell kind of domestic threats. This is not healthy. This isn't good. Kenya, as I'd mentioned in my earlier remarks, is one of a few countries which has genuine external enemies, right? The Al-Shabaab threat in Somalia being specific to that. Malawi doesn't have that, right? South Africa doesn't have that, right? All of this is kind of for domestic stuff. So I think it's a really good question. There are benefits. I don't want to ramble on much longer. There are benefits to Kenya, but the Kenyan government has not communicated what that is. I'll give you one. It looks like for the first time since 1945 going to be genuine reform within the United Nations. And it looks like Africa is going to have a permanent spot on the Security Council. Maybe that doesn't matter. But don't think for a second that the bilateral deployment of Kenya into Haiti was not part of that broader conversation. Don't think that the non-NATO ally distinction is not part of what will be inevitably the U.S. Kind of advancing and making sure that they can put Kenya on there. Last point in terms of in terms of the cost, right? The formalization, and I don't know what the right word is, but I'll just call it formalization, signing, whatever, of the Kenya as the non-NATO ally was June 24th of this year. Everybody knows what happened on June 25th, right? And, you know, I've spoken to relationships, you know, within various governments, and I said, that's a hell of a time to be saying that, you know, we are 100, you know, we as in the United States are 100% behind Kenya, and then we start having youth mowed down, right, in front of Parliament. Now, that was police, that wasn't military. The non-NATO ally has to do with defense and not policing, but the optics are the same, right? So there's a lot to unpack there, and I think that it needs to be unpacked by the government.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So Wangari, let's turn to transparency and accountability, right? So in our constitution, the way the three arms of government are structured, you have the executive that effectively decides how much you spend, where we spend it. They come up with budgets and, you know, make them. Then you have the judiciary that basically checks what the executive is doing. Often in our system, it's an adversarial system, so they don't initiate issues on their own. There will be a case that will be brought before the courts for them to address, particularly on whether something is constitutional or not. Then you have Parliament, and Parliament's role in Kenya is that in addition to legislative enactment, they also are supposed to play an oversight role. So Senate is supposed to have oversight over the counties, Parliament is supposed to have oversight over the national government, and they have the powers to play an inquisitorial role, where effectively they can ask questions about, you know, what are you doing, etc. This week, Julians alluded to the fact that we have the Public Finance Management Bill, which is going to be undergoing public participation tomorrow. Next week, we have the tax laws amendment bills, the tax procedures bill, and so on and so forth. Because business laws amendment bill, the whole of next week, we have many sort of public participation things. But the key question that I have always asked myself, and turning also to what Declan said, and actually yesterday, I think it was yesterday, our cabinet secretary for the National Treasury said that we're losing 2 billion shillings a day, 2 billion shillings a day to corruption, which if you think about it is just insane. You know, who's stealing the money? Where's the money going? None of us really knows those answers. But is Parliament playing its oversight role? And why would we, you know, in a country where our constitution actually allows for full transparency? Under the constitution, if I wanted information from any government organization, in theory, all I should need to do is to send them a letter and ask them, give me this information on this contract. Why did you enter into this contract? What was the reason for it? I say in theory because we know in practice it doesn't happen, right? So Wangari, just unpack this for us, right? What's your sense of where transparency and accountability is going? Do you think the mechanisms that are there are actually doing their work in terms of policing and oversight? And where do you think we should be heading to? Over to you, Wangari.
Hey, Daniel, I don't know if you need another hour. I don't know how even where to begin. But I'll try to touch on the key issues that you brought out, right? So, as was said by Declan and also by Julians, you know, defense spending is a tricky one in the budget, right? There's always kind of the tension between transparency when it comes to national defense and security spending and accountability, transparency and also safety. Right? People say if we show what we're doing in spending, in national security, then our adversaries are going to be like, oh, they have these many things, and so now we know how they're spending, and so this is how we're going to attack Kenya or whatever, right? So it poses a security threat. But, and I think it was true that Declan, you said that we do have some threats from Al-Shabaab, very real threats, right? And this is why every time you go to, wherever you're going, you have to go through 5-6 security checks before you can do anything, right? Which never used to be there before. So when you think about what is the benefit, you have to think about what is the balance, right? What's the balance between understanding or having a transparent budget, especially when it comes to security, versus the issues that we're having around corruption and accountability? Is it better as a nation for us to to be able to see how the defense ministry and security sectors are spending in light of the fact that we have a highly corrupt economy, a very highly corrupt administration, versus understanding how they're using that money, not only just how they're using it, but also how it's aligning to other budget priorities. We have Vision 2030, we have, the Kenya Kwanza initiative and all these kind of plans that we have. Even the budgets have different plans. How are our national security investments aligning with our other investments? These are things that are not completely obvious to us, because we always fall back and say, we cannot show our defense spending because, it's our defense spending and, it's secret. So for me, it's been a debate, and it's a debate worldwide, not just in Kenya, whether we should be able to have that kind of transparency. For me, I think it would be important to have that transparency, just because and there are ways within monitoring, budget monitoring, and then the tools that we have for including the standard chart of accounts, which is how the government tracks its spending, to code financing or spending in security, so that we can have insight, but we don't have to know every single detail. We don't have to know how many tanks Kenya has, or how many, I don't know, machine guns or whatever it is, Kalashnikovs, I don't know. Maybe you know better than me. Maybe Kalashnikovs is a very old gun. I have no idea. I watch too many movies. Whether, the level of detail. But I think it is very, very, very important. When it comes to decentralization, and you think about how budgets, how you then now think about county governments and how they're spending, and then a national government and how they're spending. It's also important to, like I said, and I reiterate again from the beginning, is that coordination is key. And whatever defense spending that we're having is well coordinated with what is also happening on the ground. So I'm not sure, you gave me so many things to speak about. I hope I touched on most of them.
So I can see Julians and Declan both want to get in there.
Yeah, I just want to double tap what you just mentioned. So with regard to oversight of budgets, like security budgets, this is not, first off, nobody's reinventing the wheel, right, for Kenya. The United States, I think, would be the right model in terms of how that gets managed. There's tremendous transparency. We have civilian oversight of CIA, right? It's managed in a certain way. I don't know the ins and outs, but civilians do, and I'm just not one of the lucky ones. Let's also not overthink, right? With all due respect to the Kenyan security services and to Kenya, there's not a lot going on that needs to be uber secret, right? Kenya's not involved in the next generation fighter jet. It's not involved in sending up satellites and intercepting ballistic missiles. Kenya's not doing that, right? Yes, there's clandestine activities that Kenya is doing. Yes, if you think about like something like the critical infrastructure protection units. If you think about the critical infrastructure protection units, there's a certain maybe about spending which can be kind of managed in a certain way. There's zero reason why we cannot have substantial visibility into that. And to be fair, I've never looked into it. I don't know if they're being super secret, if it's reasonable or unreasonable, or if it's silly. But none of this would be new, and it's not that big of a deal.
Thank you. Are the various organs of the government, please let's remember the government has three arms: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. I think the legislature has been a huge flop in terms of oversight, and not just on security spending. I think on all spending. The reason why we are in the present situation where debt vulnerabilities are hanging over our head is because we ran close to a decade, and you can go back and check these numbers because they're available. We ran close to a decade of fiscal deficits running in the hundreds of billions. In ratio terms, we were always 6% or to 8% of GDP in deficit. That's not sustainable. We don't even run our houses that way. Yeah? And that's why we are where we are. And it is a job of Parliament, when the National Treasury comes with its spending estimates, maybe we need another session to discuss the budget cycle. When they come with spending estimates and they table them before the National Assembly, it is their job to tell the executive, we can't do this. can you go back to the drawing board and rationalize your spending? And that is why Parliament is structured in committees. You have the Budget Committee. We have the Public Accounts Committee. We have the Public Investment. Because you and I might not know all these details, but they're supposed to have full visibility. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The deficit, as you're right, you're very right, has grown, I think, over the last 10 years. I think the last time there was no deficit was actually in the Kibaki days.
2003 to 2004.
2003, 2004. Crazy if you think about it. So, we are coming to the end of this session. I wanted to ask, and you can check online, are there any chats, questions you have seen online? On Slido, there's one question which I think we've already tackled about how can regional cooperation mitigate cross-border security challenges like violent extremism and trade disruptions. I think we've been talking about that. Any questions online for those of you who can check on the chat? If there isn't anything online, I want to open the floor for a question or two from anyone in the room or observation before I ask our very eloquent panelists to give their closing remarks. There's a gentleman there at the back, John Mark, and there's a lady here at the front. So maybe we can, please, John Mark, carry on.
Thank you. I've been listening the last few minutes about the defense industry. And I had a question. You mentioned the opportunity cost of spending on defense vis-a-vis social services. But I also understand, especially at the tail end of the last administration, there's been a recent development of a very nascent defense industry in Kenya. We have the small arms factory that was inaugurated in Ruiru, I think, 2022. We have a small ordnance factory in Eldoret. The military are doing the ships now. Kenyatta something in Kisumu. Do you think these economic benefits could override those costs? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Let's take the second question from here at the front. I think there are two hands up, and then we'll tackle all questions together. Julian, it sounded like you want to touch on the first one. Okay.
Don't be shy.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for the session. My question is with regards the final session you've had on accountability. And I would like to ask, why is it that we still expect that same legislators who have shown that there's a significant interplay between themselves and the executive to be the same whistleblowers to defend the rights of the public? Because we've seen in instances where a bill goes through like the finance bill, when the president chose to exercise his power as the executive to turn down the bill, you saw legislators around him standing in togetherness with him. So why do you expect that the same people involved in the pushing of some of these agendas to be the same people who will call out the same people or be the whistleblowers on some of these agendas that we are very much against? So is it a problem on our front, on us being very, I guess, naive, on us expecting them to do both things at the same time, or what should we do in such an instance?
Thank you very much. That's almost like a social justice question, and whether in reality the government of Kenya and the parliament are the right people to police. Thank you. The lady next to you.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, good afternoon, sorry. So my question had to do with...
Do you mind? Yeah.
Oh, my question had to do with reducing the expenditure when it comes to wages that Julian spoke about. It also speaks to Victor's question. When it comes to reducing the wage expenditure, you spoke about how Kenya's wage expenditure is at 46%, while it should be at around 35%. When you look online, you research, the salaries of MPs and a lot of government officials are quite high in comparison to other countries which are developed and other developing countries. So how do you expect the legislatures who are benefiting from these high salaries to be able to reduce the wage expenditure?
Thank you very much. So I'll ask our panelists to take the 3 questions in whichever order you prefer. Declan, I also have a question online for you after this. So, yeah.
All right, let me take so that's the reason why we have institutions in place. The reason why the 2010 Constitution set up the Salaries and Remuneration Commission is to be able to rationalize this kind of anomalies in terms of the wage structure. I think 13 years down the line, we've moved the needle, but we haven't yet. And one of the proposals which I remember was very pivotal, but has met a lot of resistance, understandably, was a proposal to have the allowances capped at a maximum of 60% of your basic pay. As you would imagine, it has been fought significantly. I still think that is something we need to push for as a country, because that would have been a huge game changer, especially in terms of the top-heavy salaries, the legislatures you're talking about, the senior civil servants in this country. Yeah, and I think it's a fight we keep on waging, because we can't give up. To the question that Victor asked around how do we expect the same legislators to be the ones who are addressing these issues of oversight, is because that is the job of Parliament. Just because it is not working, one, it tells us we should ask ourselves, who are we sending to the National Assembly as our representatives? Because that is their job. I put out a tweet one time around indicating that we've been given a 3-year window to transition from cash to accrual accounting. And a legislator reaches out and is asking, by the way, what is this thing you're talking about? I mean, come on. You're supposed to be passing this thing on the floor of the House. So there we are, man. I think it's a day at a time. Public finance is a labor of love, as I've come to learn.
No. I think I'll just jump in and then let Wangari speak. I had MPs, after passing the finance bill, say, I was not very clear on this thing. This thing, how it got there, I don't know. It was not explained to me that way. You know, I mean, Wangari?
Okay. The question around the investments, like the small arms factory, and you're saying that I think the military was working in the ships. My question is, what Declan was saying, what is the role of military? What are they supposed to be? What are they supposed to be doing? Are they supposed to be in that sector, right? Is that the best use of their time? Is that the best use of our resources? The small arms factory could add something to the economy, but what about value addition in agriculture? What about other industries? What about manufacturing? Is that the best we can do in terms of how, is that, in talking about opportunity costs, is that the best use of our resources? Is that where we're going to get the most revenues? Is that how our economy is going to grow? I would argue to say no. I would argue that actually if we followed our national plan, our visioning strategies, our money actually should be redirected somewhere else. And I think that is also one of the core challenges in public finance. Everybody looks at the money. We have protests around the finance bill, but nobody's protesting when we're passing the Appropriations Act. Nobody's protesting when asking, why are we spending this much in energy? Or why aren't we spending this much in energy? Why aren't we spending more in climate? That is actually where I think we should be really engaging rather than, and it's interesting, I always ask myself as a public finance professional also, we always pass the revenue bill after we pass the expenditure bill. So we say, we're going to spend 1 million shillings, but we don't know how we're going to raise it. We're just going to raise it somehow, right? This is how we think we're going to raise it, right? So there's something that we need to think about there. To talk about, the people who are passing the bills are the same people who we're having problems with. I mean, it's really the impunity levels, not just in Kenya, also across the continent, are high. I mean, all of us watched on TV when different officials were talking about how much money they were able to earn in a few years, like millions of shillings. And we sat there and we took it. And really that is a level of, we also have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to accept and what are we willing to take, right? If I can see clearly that we have we're talking about an opaque view into our leadership. How are we? What is the integrity levels of our leadership, and how do we then expect, based on that integrity level, that they're going to lead us, right? They say, I don't know in which tribe, that the fish rots from the head, right? So we also have to ask ourselves. Now we're looking at Gen Z as our oversight committee. Because we have, how many oversight do we have? We have Office of Auditor General, we have Parliament, we have control of budget. I mean, we even have EACC. And I always say, by the time a country has a separate organ for corruption, we are lost. Because corruption should be dealt with at the source, right? So I think now we're looking at Gen Z. In fact, I saw a poster saying that we're supposed to be striking again on Thursday. Guys are just like, Allah, Gen Z is back. What happened? We don't know what's happening. So I think there's a little bit of, there's a lacuna, I think, when it comes to that. I think the last one I'm going to talk about was reducing expenditures. And the current recurrent bill is very high. And on the note of decentralization, the recurrent bill and the wage bill actually has exploded. And managing that is part of what the IMF keeps telling us, that we need to manage our wage bill. We need to bring those expenditures lower. It is very difficult when we have such a big civil service. It's very difficult when we have a decentralized government structure. And it's also very difficult when we're not raising the requisite revenues on the other side to pay for this administration. So we really need to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves how we're going to fix this.
Thank you very much. I think our eminent panelists identify as Gen Z on these sort of social issues. Turning to you, Declan, there's a number of questions have come through on Slido, and we won't be able to take all of them. And I see some of them have actually been dealt with. But there's one that is quite specific about Huduma Number. And I'll read it. The question is, what role can the Huduma Number and other data-driven initiatives play in improving inter-agency coordination on security and also on public finance? Declan, any thoughts on that issue?
Well, so there's a lot of opacity around the Huduma Number and what was going to be done with that, right? This was obviously quite a big complaint and grievance and movement against the use of that. People refused to sign up. It was a big issue because people didn't know. It felt like the rhetoric at the time was, this is how they're going to rig the election, right? We're going to find out exactly where it is. Our census sucks. And we need to, Huduma Number is the best way because access to mobile phones and M-Pesa and whatnot is a more reliable indicator of population. I think it's arguable, but that was what was being discussed. And so then the next iteration was, well, we've got this Huduma Number. How is it going to be used for public services? How is this going to be used to potentially steal? There was that whole dialogue, right? I trust we are all kind of tracking that. What I think the issue comes up, and it's similar to the other questions that were asked, is there is no social contract in Kenya, certainly now, right? I think we've been proven social contract in this sense, in the kind of orthodox political science, sorry if I'm sounding like a nerd, where the public leases for a period of time authority to be governed, right? Yeah. And then the argument these days is that democracy is the way to do that, and as things change, democracy allows for course corrections. But Kenya has managed its social contract historically through ethnic brokerage and tribalism, right? So we had voting patterns around MPs, based off of ethnic community, and then those representatives would go to Parliament and thrash out stuff, and then we would get benefits, we as the community and people who were supportive of that. That was always flawed, unfortunately, and now we can see the issue. The big turn happened around 2013, but really, and maybe Julians has a better insight into this, when Kenya started taking on external debt. The money that was the cash injections into the economy displaced other kinds of required spending, and it allowed more theft to occur. And because of the significance of that money, the corruption that we had, particularly before we started being a wealthier country, it was land grabbing, and then the dividends of corruption were felt more tangibly with people, and people tolerated that. Now what we have is a model more akin to what you see in Nigeria, where it was always based off of foreign exchange and dollars and petrodollars, and that money is taken in cash form and taken out of the country, and we're seeing that dynamic play out here in a much more acute way than we've ever before. This is where that animosity is. I guess the last point that I would make somewhat controversially is I think that we need to realize that oftentimes it's not corruption we hate, it's not benefiting enough from corruption. And we need to really begin to hold institutions and one another accountable for that. Otherwise, this particular situation is going to become much more the norm, which I take it from January 25th we don't like.
From June 24th.
June 25th, excuse me.
So I think we'll wrap it up there. I know we are 10 minutes over the time. There are a number of very interesting questions. For example, Declan has touched briefly on the question to do with, would you agree that corruption is ingrained in our culture as Kenyans, hence making it nearly impossible to address? A highly controversial question. I certainly hope that this generation, particularly the people in this audience, will change that. And I think the Gen Z protests showed us for the first time that it is possible to have a protest that is not ethnically based. And like what Declan is referring to as ethnic brokerage might in due course be a thing of the past. I say might because there's always the idea that the young should be put in the old wineskins. And we certainly hope that that is not going to be the case with you. So I want to close this session today. And we've talked about many things. We've talked about the challenges. I think we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges we face, the development challenges, the challenges of oversight and transparency. But I got the sense of a glimmer of hope from the conversations today. The glimmer of hope being that we have the most youthful population on the African continent. We talked about the glimmer of hope with the Gen Z protests on June 25th. We've talked about the glimmer of hope in the context of perhaps the next generation will change the attitude towards corruption, less tolerance on corruption, and much more sort of demand for action and demand for change. I think the events of this last weekend, where churches were returning back donations that were given, was a good first step. And if the general populace can take this as the new norm, as the new requirement for transparency and accountability in this country, like Wangari says, it will be dealt with at the grassroots. It will not need ESCC or any other sort of body that dealing with corruption by creating an organization that looks after corruption. So there is hope, and I hope that this is going to change things. And with that shared prosperity will come a shared sense of peace and security within the region. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our very eloquent panelists for such an engaging conversation. Thank you. Sorry? Yes.
A final request from me. Public sector hearings for budget 25-26 are happening at KICC this whole week. Please, let's go there. Because, you know, many of us wait until we see finance bill being tabled in the House. That's when we come alive. No, it starts now. Public sector hearings mean we have finished the sector working groups. The sectors have prescribed the priorities for the next financial year. Now what are we dealing with? How much money do you want? Because, yes, and the tax laws amendment bill and the tax procedures amendment bill, all of them. So let's meet at KICC. And if you go to the Parliament website, National Assembly, under the section on bills, you will find all the 6 bills there. So you can comb through. You can also go on X and follow me on my handle. I break them down.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a wonderful Wangari, I see you influencing there. Okay, just to show our token of don't run away yet. To show our token of appreciation, we just wanted to give you like a few gifts to say thank you very much. No, that's why I said. Rebecca. Either way is okay.